Did medieval religion truly shackle women in chains of ignorance? Were they just silent figures in the shadows, denied any power or voice from the very beginning of the Middle Ages to its end around the 15th century? Prepare to uncover the surprising truths that shatter those old, tired stories. Number 5. The lie of widespread witch burning. When people think of the Middle Ages, often a dark image comes to mind: women screaming at the stake, accused of witchcraft and burned by the church. This terrifying picture is deeply rooted in popular culture, appearing in countless books, movies, and even casual conversations. It suggests that the medieval church was obsessed with hunting down women, especially as witches, seeing them as inherently evil and a threat to religious order. The idea that thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, of women were systematically persecuted and executed for witchcraft during the entire medieval period, from roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, is a powerful and unsettling narrative. It paints a picture of a relentless, brutal institution, constantly on the lookout for magical malfeasance, particularly from women. This narrative often implies that medieval society was steeped in a widespread, official program of witch eradication, driven by religious dogma and carried out by church authorities. It makes one believe that accusations of witchcraft were commonplace, easily made, and almost always ended in a fiery execution, especially for women. This lie connects the medieval period directly to the horrific witch trials, presenting them as a constant, defining feature of the era. It suggests that the belief in malevolent magic and the persecution of those accused of it, particularly women, was a central pillar of medieval religious and legal life. However, the historical record tells a far more nuanced and surprising story. The widespread systematic witch hunts and mass executions that popular culture often attributes to the entire Middle Ages simply did not happen during most of that 1,000-year span. The period of intense witch trials, where thousands were accused and executed across Europe, largely occurred much later, primarily in the early modern period, from the late 15th century through the 18th century, long after the traditional end of the Middle Ages. This timing distinction is crucial. During the High and Late Middle Ages, the belief in witches, who could make pacts with the devil, fly through the air, and gather in Sabbaths, was not the dominant or officially sanctioned view of the Church. In fact, for much of the medieval period, the Church was actually skeptical of such claims. Canon law, the body of laws and regulations made by ecclesiastical authority for the government of a Christian organization or church, often considered belief in magical flight and night riding as mere pagan superstition, not a genuine threat. The Canon Episcopi, the canonical collection from around 906 CE, explicitly condemned the belief in women riding at night with pagan goddesses as an illusion created by the devil, stating that those who believed such things were infidels. This document, widely circulated and influential, actually discouraged the very idea of witches with supernatural powers, suggesting that such beliefs were deluded and not real. And medieval theologians and legal scholars for a significant part of the era viewed claims of maleficium or harmful magic as either superstition or simple fraud, rather than evidence of a pact with a demonic entity. If someone was accused of causing harm through magic, it was more likely to be treated as a criminal act of poisoning or deception, or even dismissed as foolishness, rather than a spiritual crime of devil worship. Records from medieval courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, show very few cases of witchcraft accusations, and even fewer executions for such charges. When cases did arise, they were often treated as isolated incidents of local superstition or attempts to defraud. For instance, in the 13th century, a woman might be accused of using a charm to make someone sick. The penalty, if any, would typically involve penance, a fine, or excommunication, not burning at the stake. The systematic pursuit of individuals for demonic witchcraft was not a central feature of medieval legal systems, whether secular or religious. The trials were more likely to focus on heresy, political crimes, or ordinary criminal offenses. The shift towards widespread witch trials began to gain momentum only in the late 15th century, with the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum or Hammer of Witches in 1487. This book, written by two German Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, was a highly influential and misogynistic treatise on witchcraft. It promoted the idea that witchcraft was real, that witches formed pacts with the devil, and that women were particularly susceptible to demonic influence. It outlined procedures for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. However, even the Malleus Maleficarum was initially met with some skepticism within the Church, and was not universally adopted as a legal or theological standard across Europe immediately upon its publication. Its impact grew over time, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, centuries after the medieval period. Before this specific period of heightened witch panic, local communities might accuse individuals of using harmful magic, but the legal and theological frameworks were not geared towards systematic persecution. Punishment for such accusations was generally less severe than death. For example, some historians point to instances where individuals were accused of using harmful charms or poisons, but these were typically treated as criminal acts, not as evidence of widespread demonic conspiracy. Professor Ronald Hutton, a distinguished historian specializing in paganism and witchcraft, highlights in his works that formal witch trials on a large scale were rare during most of the medieval period. He notes that the number of executions for witchcraft in the medieval era pales in comparison to the thousands who died during the early modern witch panics. Similarly, Dr. Catherine Ryder's research into medieval magic and witchcraft emphasizes that medieval legal systems were more concerned with specific acts of harm rather than a broad hunt for devil-worshipping sorcerers. She points out that the concept of a witch as a person making a pact with the devil and engaging in evil rituals was still developing throughout the Middle Ages and only solidified in the late 15th century. This emerging concept was then significantly amplified in the centuries that followed, especially by fears and social anxieties rooted in religious conflicts and changing legal practices of the early modern era. The idea of mass witch hunts being a defining characteristic of medieval religious life is a historical misunderstanding, largely projected backward from the more intense later persecutions. Number 4, the lie that the church suppressed women's education and literacy. A widely circulated story claims that the medieval church intentionally kept women uneducated, preventing them from learning to read or write, especially Latin, the language of scholarship and religious texts. This narrative often suggests that women were seen as intellectually inferior or too easily swayed by temptation, and therefore restricting their access to books and learning was a deliberate policy to maintain their submissive role in society and within the church itself. The image presented is one of widespread female illiteracy, enforced by an institution that feared the intellectual awakening of women. This lie implies that if a woman could read, it was an exception, a rare privilege, or perhaps even a rebellious act against the established religious order. It suggests that convents, if they existed, were not places of learning, but rather places of seclusion, offering little intellectual stimulation. Furthermore, it implies that access to sacred texts, theological discussions, and the broader world of knowledge was exclusively reserved for men, particularly male clergy. The idea is that the church actively built barriers to women's intellectual development, keeping them in a state of ignorance for centuries. Yet, a closer look at historical evidence reveals a far more complex and often contradictory reality. While formal education was not universal for either men or women in the Middle Ages, and certainly not comparable to modern mass schooling, the church actually played a significant role in promoting literacy and education for certain groups of women, particularly within monastic communities. Convents, communities of women religious, served as vital centers of learning throughout the medieval period. These institutions provided opportunities for women to acquire literacy, study theology, copy manuscripts, and even produce their own literary and scholarly works. Nuns were taught to read and write, primarily in Latin, because it was essential for their daily religious practices, such as reciting the divine office, reading scripture, and studying patristic texts, writings by early Christian theologians. Many convents maintained impressive libraries, containing not only religious texts, but also classical literature, scientific treatises, and historical chronicles. For instance, the Abbey of Gandersheim in Saxony, a powerful imperial convent in the 10th century, was home to Rotsvit of Gandersheim, often considered the first female playwright in Europe. Rotsvit wrote Latin dramas, poems, and historical works, demonstrating a high level of classical learning and literary skill. Her works show familiarity with authors like Terence and Virgil, proving that medieval women in convents could access and engage with sophisticated intellectual material. Another towering example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, composer, philosopher, and polymath. Hildegard was not only highly literate in Latin, but also produced an extensive body of work, including theological treatises, scientific and medicinal texts, moral teachings, and liturgical music. Her writings were widely respected and consulted by popes, emperors, and leading intellectuals of her time. Her literacy and intellectual prowess were not exceptional isolated cases, but rather indicative of the intellectual environment that could flourish within a well-resourced medieval convent. The letters and writings of other prominent female figures, like Heloise, the 12th century French abbess, scholar, and philosopher, further demonstrate the intellectual capabilities and educational opportunities available to some women. Heloise corresponded in Latin with Peter Abelard, one of the leading logicians and theologians of the age, on complex philosophical and theological matters, showcasing her profound learning. Noblewomen, too, often received an education, sometimes at home, sometimes in convents. They were taught to read and write, manage estates, and engage in courtly culture, which often involved reading and composing poetry. Queens and countesses, as patrons of the arts and learning, frequently commissioned books and supported scribes and scholars, demonstrating their own engagement with literacy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was a noted patron of poets and scholars, herself a woman of considerable culture and education. Beyond the monastic and noble elite, there is evidence that literacy, at least basic literacy, was not entirely absent among some women in urban areas. While not widespread like today, some women involved in commerce or craft guilds might have needed rudimentary literacy for record-keeping or managing their businesses. Or guilds sometimes provided education for their members' children, including daughters. Manuscript evidence from the Middle Ages also offers clues. Many medieval manuscripts include notes or ownership marks indicating they belonged to or were read by women. Books of hours, popular devotional prayer books, were particularly common among laywomen, suggesting a desire and ability to engage with religious texts independently. These books often contain Latin prayers, but also vernacular, local language sections, indicating a broader spectrum of literacy. Historians such as Caroline Walker Bynum, in her work on medieval religious women, meticulously document the intellectual lives of nuns and mystics, revealing their active participation in theological discourse and their significant literary output. Similarly, research by Professor Joan Ferrante on women in medieval literature and learning showcases the numerous female scholars, writers, and patrons who thrived in medieval Europe. The claim that the Church universally suppressed women's education overlooks the vibrant intellectual life within convents, the education of noblewomen, and the practical literacy of some urban women, all of which were often facilitated or at least tolerated by various parts of the medieval Church. Number 3, the lie that medieval women were solely domestic, confined to home. A persistent misconception paints medieval women as entirely confined to the domestic sphere, their lives solely revolving around household chores, child-rearing, and serving their husbands. This narrative suggests that women had no public role, no engagement in the economy, and no life outside the walls of their homes or, at most, their village. It implies that medieval society, heavily influenced by religious norms, enforced a strict separation of spheres, with men dominating all public life and women relegated exclusively to private, familial duties. This lie often evokes images of women spinning wool by the hearth, never venturing beyond the garden gate, and having no involvement in the bustling world of trade, craft, or even farming beyond their immediate subsistence. It makes one believe that medieval women were passive figures, wholly dependent on male relatives for their survival and public representation, effectively invisible in the broader social and economic landscape of the era. The idea is that religious teachings, often interpreted through a lens of patriarchal control, dictated this domestic seclusion, thereby limiting women's contributions to society and their personal freedoms. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that medieval women across various social classes were deeply and actively involved in almost every aspect of economic and social life, far beyond the confines of the home. Their contributions were vital to the survival and prosperity of families, communities, and the broader medieval economy. In rural areas, the vast majority of the population, women worked alongside men in the fields, performing crucial agricultural tasks such as planting, harvesting, threshing, and tending livestock. They were integral to the production of food and raw materials. Beyond the fields, they were responsible for processing food, brewing ale, spinning and weaving textiles, making candles, and preparing goods for sale. These were not mere domestic chores, but essential economic activities that sustained the household and often generated income. For example, estate records from medieval manors frequently list women as performing labor services, paying rents, and participating in agricultural production alongside men. They were not just helpers, they were direct contributors to the agricultural economy. In urban centers, women were active participants in trade and craft guilds. Many women ran their own businesses, especially in trades traditionally associated with women, such as brewing, baking, textile production, and food retail. They could be independent merchants, selling their wares in markets and fairs. In many guilds, women had the right to be full members, train apprentices, and even hold positions of authority, particularly if they were widows who inherited their husbands' businesses. For example, in Paris, the 13th century Livre des Métiers Book of Trades lists over 100 occupations where women worked, including embroiderers, silk workers, brewers, and even surgeons. In cities like London and Cologne, women were prominent in the textile industry, from processing raw materials to weaving and selling finished cloth. The widows, in particular, often enjoyed considerable legal and economic autonomy. They could inherit property, run businesses, and act as heads of households, a testament to the fact that women were not solely defined by their marital status or perpetual subordination. Legal documents, wills, and guild records from cities across Europe provide abundant evidence of women owning property, entering into contracts, and engaging in commercial transactions independently. They were litigants in court, business partners, and often the primary breadwinners in their families. Beyond manual labor and commerce, women also held various professional roles. Some women practiced medicine, often as midwives, healers, or even barber surgeons. While formal medical education was largely male-dominated, women's practical knowledge and experience were widely sought after in their communities. Women also worked in service roles, as domestic servants in wealthy households, innkeepers, or even as scribes and illuminators in monastic scriptoria, particularly in convents. The portrayal of women solely as domestic creatures also ignores the vital role of aristocratic women. Noblewomen manage vast estates in their husband's absence, which could be for extended periods due to wars or crusades. They oversaw agricultural production, administered justice, collected rents, and defended castles. These were powerful administrative and political roles that required significant skills and authority far beyond the confines of a typical home. Queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile, exercised immense political power, ruled kingdoms as regents, led armies, and shaped international relations. Their lives were anything but confined to the domestic sphere. Religious women, too, like abbesses, managed vast estates, controlled significant economic resources, and held spiritual authority over their convents and often surrounding communities. The historical reality reveals that medieval women were active, dynamic participants in virtually all spheres of life, their roles diverse and essential, defying the narrow domestic stereotype. Number 2. The lie that women were universally oppressed and powerless by the church. The prevailing narrative often paints the medieval church as a monolithic institution that universally oppressed women, denying them any form of power, agency, or spiritual authority. This story suggests that the church saw women as inherently inferior, weak, and dangerous, primarily due to the biblical account of Eve's sin. It implies that women were systematically excluded from religious leadership, intellectual pursuits, and public life, relegated to a secondary status, and denied any voice or influence within the vast structure of medieval Christianity. This lie suggests that the very theology and canon law of the church were designed to keep women subjugated, ensuring they had no roles beyond domesticity or subservient positions within religious orders. It leaves the impression that women were passive recipients of religious doctrine, with no means to shape it, interpret it, or contribute to it in any meaningful way. The common understanding is that any power a woman might have possessed was in spite of the church, not facilitated by it. However, a careful examination of the historical record reveals a much more nuanced picture. While it is true that women were excluded from the ordained priesthood and high ecclesiastical offices like bishop or pope, their influence, power, and spiritual agency within the church were far from negligible. In many ways, the church, particularly through monasticism, offered women pathways to authority, learning, and independence that were often unavailable in the secular world. Convents were centers of significant female power. The abbesses, the heads of female monastic communities, wielded substantial authority. They governed large estates, managed considerable wealth, administered justice within their jurisdictions, and exercised spiritual oversight over numerous nuns and lay dependents. Some imperial abbesses, such as those of Quedlinburg or Gandersheim in the Holy Roman Empire, held vast territories, commanded armies, and even minted their own coins, effectively acting as feudal lords. These women were powerful political figures, negotiating with emperors and popes, engaging in diplomacy, and shaping the destiny of their regions. Their authority was recognized and often supported by the church hierarchy. Female mystics and visionaries also held immense spiritual authority. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Bridget of Sweden, Catherine of Siena, and Julian of Norwich were highly influential figures in medieval Europe. Their visions, prophecies, and theological writings were widely respected, sought after by popes, kings, and scholars. They often acted as spiritual advisors to powerful men, intervened in political disputes, and advocated for church reform. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, corresponded with emperors, kings, and archbishops, openly criticizing their moral failings and offering divine counsel. Catherine of Siena, a lay Dominican, fearlessly urged popes to return to Rome from Avignon and became an influential spiritual and political advisor, often dictating letters to the most powerful men in Europe. These women were not dismissed or ignored, their voices were amplified, sometimes precisely because they were women, seen as channels for divine revelation. Their authority stemmed not from institutional office, but from perceived direct communion with God, which paradoxically allowed them a level of influence that might have been impossible through conventional channels. Furthermore, the veneration of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, was an incredibly powerful force in medieval Catholicism. Holy Mary was seen as the Queen of Heaven, the ultimate intercessor, and a figure of immense compassion and power. As her cult, which included the construction of magnificent cathedrals dedicated to her, the widespread recitation of the Hail Mary, and numerous Marian feast days, elevated a female figure to a position of profound spiritual significance. This veneration, while not translating into direct female priestly roles, certainly showcased the Church's capacity to elevate and revere women, embodying virtues and power. Numerous female saints, from martyrs to holy women, were also celebrated and revered, serving as role models and objects of devotion. Their lives demonstrated agency, piety, and spiritual strength. Lay women, too, played crucial roles in parish life and local religious practices. They formed confraternities, supported local churches, participated in pilgrimages, and engaged in various forms of piety. Their active involvement sustained the daily religious life of communities. While official church doctrine sometimes reflected patriarchal societal norms, and women were indeed excluded from certain roles, the practical reality was one of significant female influence and power within various facets of the medieval church, challenging the simplistic narrative of universal oppression. The church, in its diverse forms, offered spaces and avenues for women to exert authority, express their spirituality, and shape the religious landscape of their time. Number 1. The lie that women were universally seen as inherently evil or inferior due to Eve's sin. A pervasive belief suggests that medieval Christian theology, heavily influenced by the story of Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, universally condemned women as inherently evil, weak, and intellectually inferior. This narrative implies that all medieval religious thinkers and institutions uniformly viewed women as perpetual temptresses, morally frail, and perpetually burdened by Eve's original transgression. It suggests that this negative portrayal was the primary, if not sole, lens through which women were understood in medieval society, leading to their systematic denigration and subjugation. This lie often points to specific misogynistic texts by certain church fathers or theologians, extrapolating their views to represent the entire medieval Christian outlook on women. It creates an image of a culture where women were constantly reminded of their supposed inherent depravity, denying them any possibility of spiritual equality or moral strength. The idea is that the stain of Eve was an indelible mark on all women, leading to a constant state of suspicion and contempt from religious authorities. However, historical and theological evidence reveals a far more complex and often contradictory set of perspectives on women in medieval Christianity. While some influential male theologians certainly articulated misogynistic views, drawing on interpretations of Eve's sin to portray women as inferior or more susceptible to temptation, these views did not represent the entirety of medieval Christian thought, nor did they negate other, more positive and empowering perspectives. The veneration of the Virgin Mary stands as a monumental counterpoint to the idea of universal female degradation. Mary, as the Mother of God, was celebrated as the ultimate embodiment of purity, humility, obedience, and divine grace. She was revered as the new Eve, whose obedience in accepting God's will redeemed the disobedience of the first Eve. The cult of the Virgin Mary was incredibly powerful and widespread throughout the Middle Ages, shaping art, architecture, literature, and popular devotion. The cathedrals were dedicated to her. Countless hymns and prayers were composed in her honor, and her image was ubiquitous. This intense devotion to a female figure who embodied the pinnacle of human virtue directly contradicts the notion that all women were seen as inherently evil. Mary offered a powerful alternative narrative, showcasing the potential for immense spiritual goodness and dignity in a woman. Beyond Mary, medieval Christianity revered numerous female saints, martyrs, virgins, and confessors. These women were celebrated for their unwavering faith, spiritual strength, acts of charity, intellectual prowess, and even their ability to challenge worldly powers. The saints like Catherine of Alexandria, Margaret of Antioch, Agatha, Lucy, and Cecilia were models of Christian virtue and courage. Their stories, widely circulated in hagiographies or biographies of saints, presented women as powerful spiritual agents capable of heroic faith, miracles, and profound theological insight. Many of these saints were depicted as defying emperors, enduring torture, and performing extraordinary feats, inspiring both men and women. Their very existence in the devotional landscape challenged any notion of inherent female weakness or depravity. And moreover, figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Bridget of Sweden, and Catherine of Siena, whom we mentioned earlier, were not only respected but also considered divinely inspired. Their writings, theological insights, and spiritual guidance were highly valued, showing that women could be profound contributors to theological thought and spiritual discourse. Their authority stemmed from their perceived direct communication with God, demonstrating that a woman's spiritual insight could be considered superior to that of many male clergy. Furthermore, medieval theologians engaged in complex debates about the nature of women. While figures like some early church fathers might have emphasized the negative aspects of Eve's sin, other theologians, particularly in the later Middle Ages, explored concepts of the human soul as genderless in its spiritual essence, or emphasized the unique virtues women possessed. The idea of imago Dei, that all humans, male and female, are created in the image of God, was a fundamental theological principle that affirmed the inherent dignity of women. The scholarly works from the period, such as those analyzed by medievalists like Georges Duby and Christiane Klapisch-Zuber, indicate that societal views of women were multifaceted, not simply a monolithic condemnation based on Eve. While a patriarchal social structure certainly existed, and some theological interpretations were indeed restrictive, they coexisted with profound veneration of female holiness, powerful female religious figures, and the widespread cult of the Virgin Mary. The idea that medieval women were universally seen as inherently evil or inferior due to Eve's sin is a gross oversimplification that ignores the rich tapestry of medieval Christian thought and devotion, which included powerful counter-narratives of female virtue, strength, and spiritual excellence.